Sonic Colors is a weird game, because I distinctly remember when Sonic Unleashed first came out, I was thinking, man, if they just made a game that was only the daytime Sonic gameplay from that game, it would be amazing. And in fact, I remember a lot of people with that sentiment back at that time. And unbelievably, they did that with Sonic Colors. That's exactly what this game is. And that's so bizarre to think of Sonic Team doing the correct, smart thing for once. I'm just not used to it. It's so strange. But they did the thing that everybody wanted them to do with this game, and it turned out really well. I really enjoy Sonic Colors, as do a lot of people. This was a very well-received Sonic game, and that was not at all the case with most Sonic games at the time. Who would have guessed that if you focus your game on the thing that makes it fun, then it would actually turn out to be good, and people would enjoy it? What a strange idea, I know. But while Sonic Colors is very similar to Unleashed, it is also quite different, as this game wasn't made by the same team that made Unleashed. This was actually made by, I guess, what at the time would be considered the Wii team, the team that made Secret Rings and Black Knight. And also, I think some people also did the Wii version of Sonic Unleashed. I'm not 100% certain about that, but there are certain similarities. So with this being a different team than the one that made Unleashed, there are some differences in how the game plays, and also just generally how it's designed. I have a feeling what happened with this game is after Black Knight, the Wii team was like, alright, we're gonna get started on our next Wii Sonic game. And, you know, perhaps they were kicking around the idea of a third storybook game, because that was kind of like the Wii series of Sonic games. But, you know, the storybook games don't exactly have amazing gameplay, and the other team just put out Unleashed with this fantastic gameplay framework, so I imagine the Wii team was like, hey guys, can we take your gameplay and use it for our next game? Because it's much better than what we have. And I think that was definitely the smart choice, because Colors is definitely much, much better than either of the storybook games. By the way, before we get into the nitty-gritty details, I want to mention real quick that if you're going to play Sonic Colors and you have a PC, I do not recommend Sonic Colors Ultimate. I think that is a very bad version of the game that kind of just made it worse than the original version, which is not what re-releases should be doing. Instead, I've added a link to my spreadsheet to Sonic Colors DX, which is a fan-made enhanced version of Sonic Colors optimized for PC, and it works really, really well. It's not as game-changing as some other things that I've recommended in the past, but it is the best way to play Sonic Colors these days. So yeah, go check that out. Who would have guessed that a fan version is a better way to play a Sonic game than the official version? That never happens. Anyway, getting into the gameplay now of Sonic Colors. As I said, this game plays a bit differently than Unleashed, and the first thing you'll notice is the controls in this game are a little bit different. It's definitely a lot more responsive and a lot tighter than Unleashed was. Steering Sonic in 3D sections feels much better in this game. It feels more like how you probably would expect it to. Unleashed was very, very loose, and it was very difficult to turn while moving at even moderate speeds, and that's been toned down here quite a bit, which is very good. Now it feels like you have more adequate control, more well-equipped for 3D platforming, which is good. And another big change with Sonic Colors is how the boost meter works. It has been quite revamped here compared to Sonic Unleashed, and I could imagine this is probably a very contentious change for some people, because, you know, Sonic Unleashed, that was building off of the Rush games, constantly boosting all the time, insane, ridiculous speeds, very built on reaction-based gameplay and stuff, and it was really fun in that game, for sure. But Colors does things a little bit differently here, because you don't get nearly as much boost compared to Unleashed. For one, quills do not fill your boost meter like they did in Sonic Unleashed. Instead, you can only fill the boost meter from killing certain enemies or collecting these capsules of white wisps. And this means that you have significantly less boost to use than you did in Unleashed. In fact, a lot of times you're not going to have any boost, and you're just going to have to do everything manually yourself in this game. And with that change of having a less boost meter, The game is also less speed-oriented. It's less about that quick reaction kind of QTE-like gameplay of slide under the thing, homing attack the enemies, light speed dash, those kinds of things. Instead, this game has a much greater emphasis on platforming, wouldn't you believe it? And honestly, I might even go on to say that I kind of prefer this way of doing the boost gameplay, because here, the boost isn't nearly as mindless as it was in Sonic Unleashed. In that game, meter management was like not a thing whatsoever. You could basically just boost all the time and you barely had to think about it. Here, meter management is important because you get a limited amount of meter, and if you want to make the most of it, you can't just be wasting it all willy-nilly, and I appreciate that. Additionally, I'm not in love with the QTE-like design of Sonic Unleashed, and Sonic Colors does have elements of that as well. Of course, it's still built off of the same gameplay framework, but it is a much smaller portion of what you're doing here. There is a lot more real manual platforming, which I find to be much more fun. Like, playing through Sonic Colors here, I found way more applications for slope jumping than I ever did in Sonic Unleashed, because Unleashed just isn't really that kind of game. Unleashed is very rigid in its design. It has a specific thing it wants you to do in a specific way most of the time. Whereas Colors, it is more freeform and open because it's just platforming, and you have the option to approach it how you want to. Do you want to boost? Do you not want to boost? Do you want to take it risky? Do you not want to take it risky? It's nice. I like that. There's a lot of platforming sections here that can feel a bit slow and plodding, but that's only if you take it slow and plodding. If you want to be a little riskier, a little bit more bold, a little bit more daring, you can absolutely rush through a lot of these platforming sequences if you've got the skill and precision to do it, and it feels very Sonic. I think it's well done. This also combos with the fact that Sonic has been given a double jump, which is not really something that they give Sonic very often, occasionally in spin-off games, but this is the first mainline Sonic game where he's had it. And I actually think it works quite well, because with the speed-oriented design of Sonic, a double jump doesn't just reset your fall height and give you a slightly higher jump. You can also extend your jump substantially by having all this speed and doing a big long jump, and then the double jump lets you jump way further. But, you gotta be careful, you gotta make sure that you have a place to land at and everything, so I think it works quite well. Even through vertical platforming sections, it gives you a lot of opportunities to skip platforms if you can properly judge your jump height and everything. So I honestly think those are all pretty good changes. I would say, in general, I kind of prefer this way of doing the boost gameplay as opposed to what Unleashed was doing. However, what Unleashed has over Colors that does make it more fun for me is the difficulty. Sonic Unleashed was kind of ridiculous and going overboard with how challenging it was, especially when you get to, the side levels and DLC levels and Eggman Land and everything. And I think that's really, really fun. It gets, stupid, ridiculously nonsense hard, and that's just really funny and enjoyable to me. Whereas Colors, they have definitely toned things down. Even compared to the normal levels of Unleashed, this is nowhere near as fast, nowhere near as difficult. So it has lost a little bit of what I loved about this boost gameplay in the first place from Unleashed, but I still think that it ends up working out really well, because I think the general design ideology behind this game is maybe a bit superior, so I still think this game is very fun. Another thing I want to say that I like that this game does is the return of zone gimmicks, because Sonic Unleashed didn't really have much in the way of zone gimmicks. All of the levels pretty much used the same assets for everything. There weren't those unique obstacles or hazards or enemies or anything in that game. Whereas Colors, it has zone gimmicks again. Starlight Carnival has the light bridges that you run on, which admittedly are kind of crappy auto-scrollers, but at least it's something. Aquarium Park has the water, Asteroid Coaster has its roller coaster sequences, Sweet Mountain has its big rocket things, and it's got the lollipop platforms that you can launch off of. So that's good. I'm glad to see that again. That's a staple of Sonic, and they didn't have that in Unleashed, which is kinda not okay. Also, big new addition to Sonic Colors. While this game might not have any alternative gameplay styles or weird, stupid gimmicks or things that ruin the game, it does still have a gimmick of its own, the Wisps. We've already talked about the White Wisp, which now uses your boost meter. But there are other Wisps in this game that function as power-ups that give you temporary abilities. While you're playing through the levels, you will occasionally run into these capsules that you can collect, and then you will have access to that Wisp power, depending on what color of Wisp it is. And I gotta say, I think the Wisp powers in this game are pretty good. I think they add some nice variety to the game, but without detracting from the core Sonic gameplay. They're not distractions, they don't get in the way, we don't stop playing a Sonic game to play a different game. They're just different kinds of abilities that the game temporarily grants you that I think integrates into the gameplay and the level design quite well. You have the Cyan Wisp, which gives you the laser ability, where you can aim it and then release, and it will rocket you forward super fast, ricocheting around on things, and that can be very useful for taking all kinds of crazy shortcuts, both ones intended by the level design and ones that you make up for yourself, which is very cool. You can also use them to shoot into these little electric things that basically teleports you to a different part of the level, which also can be used for shortcuts. And I think that's pretty cool. The Cyan Wisp is probably my favorite one. I think it's really, really fun. Another good Wisp is the Yellow Wisp, the Drill Wisp. This lets you dig into the ground or also go through water, and you can basically, like, fly around. You have free movement on a 2D plane. And it works pretty well. You can speed yourself up while doing this, but it also makes it harder to turn, so, you know, there's a balance between maneuverability and speed that you want to hit to make sure that, you know, you don't bounce into walls and things and slow yourself down or hit enemies, but you also just want to go quickly, of course, because it's a Sonic game. Yeah, I think this Wisp works really well. It's very fun. You have the Orange Wisp, which gives you the rocket ability, which just makes you shoot up really high into the sky, and then you go into a free fall after it. And this Wisp is okay. I think the major problem with this is there's a really long startup animation before the rocket takes off that I feel you could just get rid of. I think it would be better if it just took off immediately. But the way they use the Rocket Wisp, I think, is pretty good. It integrates well into level design. You can take big shortcuts and, like, vertical platforming and stuff like that, and obviously there are routes that you can only get to using this Wisp ability. Yeah, I think it's pretty good. One Wisp that I'm not too hot on is the Blue Wisp, which gives you the Cube abilities. So there are some special kind of blue ring box platforms that you sometimes run into, and the Cube Wisp, it turns you into a cube, and then you fall to the ground and smash into it, and that transforms all of the blue rings into boxes, and the boxes into blue rings. They switch back and forth. And this is utilized for platforming, where there will be boxes and rings mixed together, and you have to swap them to, you know, get rid of walls so you can get through them, but make sure you have solid ground under your feet, and it's kind of interesting. But again, similar to the Rocket Wisp, there's a big delay in animation when you activate it, so it just kind of doesn't have great pacing to it. But I think the platforming design here and how they lay out all these sets of cubes and things, I think it works pretty well. It's just a little clunky to use, but it's okay. It's not horrible, I don't think. There's also the Green Wisp, which gives you the hover ability, which basically just lets you fly, and it also gives you access to the Lightspeed Dash, which Sonic normally can't do in this game. You need the Green Wisp for it. And it's alright. My main problem with this Wisp is that it just goes kind of slow, and that's not very fun. But again, it's utilized pretty well, so I still think it's okay for the most part. There's also the Pink Wisp, which gives you the Spike ability, which is one of the most interesting ones, I think. This allows you to spin dash, which you normally can't do in this game, which is pretty cool. And also the Spike allows you to stick to walls and ceilings, so you can kind of spider your way around. And the spin dash goes really, really fast, so you get this kind of cool thing of scaling around the place really, really quickly. And it's nice. But the functionality of the spin dash and the way it launches you is a little clunky in this. It controls a little bit strangely, and it's hard to get a feel for it, so not my favorite Wisp, but again, I think it's pretty okay, and the level design is built for it in a pretty nice way, so, you know, it works for the most part. And then finally, we have the Purple Wisp, which grants you the Frenzy ability, which basically just turns you into a monster that'll destroy anything you touch. It'll kill enemies, it'll destroy these special breakable blocks, and as you destroy more and more things, you get bigger and bigger, which, yeah, it doesn't really do much other than just you have a larger hitbox. Yeah, this Wisp is not great for me. You know, there's some things where you can access certain areas by destroying things with it, which is kind of cool, but actually using the Wisp, you don't really do much of anything. You just kind of hold forward and everything dies, so that one's kind of lame. But at least it's not too intrusive. It doesn't take too long most of the time, so it's fine. And those are all the Wisp abilities, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are definitely ones here that are better than others, but overall, I think the Wisps are a really good addition to the gameplay of Sonic Colors. It adds some variety to things, but it also adds nicely to the routing and the opportunities for taking shortcuts, because you have to think about where the Wisps are and where their shortcuts are, because sometimes there'll be a Wisp shortcut way later in the level, and you have to, earlier on, grab the Wisp and not use it and save it, so that way you can get to the shortcut and use it then for a really big boost. And that's pretty cool. There's some interesting things going on with how you incorporate Wisps into playing the game quickly and efficiently that I like, and most of them, I think, are fairly fun to use, or at least not intrusive, so yeah, they're pretty good if you ask me. My only issue with Wisps overall would be that there's a little bit of a pause before you activate the Wisp that I feel just doesn't need to be there. You could just immediately activate the Wisp power, and I think that would just work better. But it's really not much of a problem. Like I said, overall, I think the Wisps are really good. I think they work well to be this game's, like, unique gimmick to make it stand apart from other Sonic games. Much better than Guns or the Werehog or whatever other crap they did in so many other Sonic games. This feels much more appropriate for a platformer game like Sonic, so I'm a big fan. Of course, this is still a Sonic game, which means we have to have terrible boss fights, and Sonic Colors definitely does not disappoint on that front. The bosses in this game, similar to most Sonic games, are not good, but at least they're not good in the classic Sonic game way of them being not good, and that most of them are over in the blink of an eye, and they barely contribute anything to the game, so at least they're not annoying or take too long or frustrating or anything like that. They are, at the very least, unintrusive, so, you know, I'll take it. That's not too bad for Sonic game standards. I will say this game has a fairly decent final boss, and believe it or not, this game does not have a supersonic final boss minigame, which I am more than a-okay with because those bosses suck in almost every Sonic game. The final boss in this game, instead of being a minigame, is just a boss, and it uses the same normal gameplay as the rest of the game, and it's much better than like 95% of all of those terrible supersonic bosses in every previous game. So yeah, I'll take that, absolutely. And that pretty much makes up everything that constitutes a normal base game playthrough of Sonic Colors, just trying to hit the credits. And I gotta say, it's a little weird playing a Sonic Team game, and the game is just good the entire time. There's no stupid crap getting in the way. There's no, alright, time to stop playing a Sonic game to play some shitty different game, or some weird minigame, or some other stupid thing that's not fun. The whole game is a Sonic game, the whole game is pretty well designed, the whole game is fun. It's just an all-around enjoyable video game experience, and Sonic Team hasn't made a game like that since Sonic 3 and Knuckles. So, it's pleasantly surprising coming to Sonic Colors after all the previous games. You can tell why this game got such positive reception when it came out, as opposed to all the other 3D Sonic games, because you play this game, and it's just fun. That's it. There's nothing more to it than that. And that's so refreshing for Sonic, which is really sad. That shouldn't be refreshing. That should be the standard, but it's not, so this feels like a breath of fresh air. It's exactly what I was talking about in my second Sonic Unleashed video, where they just said, hey, how about, for this Sonic game, call me crazy, but think about it, what if we tried just making a Sonic game? And they did it, and it worked. Oh my goodness. Maybe all that fucking stupid bullshit we were doing in all the previous games wasn't actually a good idea, and it seems like with Sonic Colors, Sonic Team has finally realized that, thank God. And that's just when we're talking about the base game stuff. There's more to enjoy about Sonic Colors. For example, red rings. This is a new thing that they have introduced into the Sonic series, and I think it's really good. This is kind of built off of the Fire Souls from Sonic and the Secret Rings. Here we have 5 red rings hidden around in every single level, and you can hunt to try to collect all of them. And normally, I'm not a fan of collectibles like this in a linear level-based platformer, because usually these kinds of things force you to slow down and start looking around, checking every nook and cranny and everything, and it gets in the way of just going and playing through the game. But in Sonic Colors, I really don't think that's much of a problem, because for the most part, they don't really hide the red rings very much. Usually the red rings are kind of just in plain sight, and they're just up for grabs, but they'll be in different parts of the levels, because Sonic Colors follows typical Sonic level design conventions. You got multi-tiered paths and everything. And the red rings are a good motivation for the player to explore all of the different routes to try to collect all the red rings. Which is really good, because most of the time, I don't have a motivation to go to the lower routes when I play through a Sonic game, because there's nothing of value there for me. It's just slower. But now, when I play through the level, I can stop and I can check some different routes and play through the level in different ways, and I get to engage with more of the game's level design that I normally would just ignore. So I think the red rings are a great addition to the Sonic formula, and I'm glad that after this game they turned into a staple that you find in almost every Sonic game. They are fantastic. And on top of that, you get a really sick reward for collecting all the red rings. We gotta talk about Game Land a little bit. So Game Land is kind of this game's multiplayer mode, but it also sort of functions as this game's equivalent to special stages. Game Land is split into 7 kind of zones, and there are 3 acts per zone, and you unlock these Game Land levels by collecting red rings. The more red rings you have, the more of these levels you unlock. And once you beat all 3 acts in a zone, you get a Chaos Emerald, and when you complete all the Game Land levels and get all the Chaos Emeralds, you actually get Super Sonic playable in the normal levels for the first time in a mainline Sonic game officially since Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which is pretty sick to finally have that reward again. There's a lot about Sonic Colors that I appreciate that makes it feel like it's kind of going back to basics, going back to what worked in the first place with Sonic. You know, just focusing on core Sonic gameplay. This game is split into zones and acts and everything. It's got a very nice, colorful, vibrant art style. The music is less butt rock. It's more high energy, feels more like classic Sonic music. The return of special stages and Super Sonic playable in normal levels. And we're not going to get into it in this video, but also a smaller focus on storytelling and more focus on just being a fun video game, which I appreciate. I've talked about before in my videos how the Sonic series definitely deviated away from how it worked originally, and for the most part, I think that was not for the better. So seeing a game like Sonic Colors go, hey, let's go back to what worked before, and they do that, and it works again here, it's very nice to see. I appreciate that. Though I do have to say, Super Sonic in this game is not the most amazing thing in the world. You know, he gives you the typical things: invincibility, faster speed, higher jump, faster acceleration. But also he gives you infinite boost in this game, which is pretty cool. Kind of lets you play it more like Sonic Unleashed, which is nice. But as a trade-off for that, Super Sonic cannot use Wisps, which a lot of people don't like, and I understand, but I actually think that's an interesting decision, because it means playing as Super Sonic or playing as normal Sonic, it gives you a slightly different experience. With normal Sonic, you get a limited boost meter, but Wisp shortcuts that you can take, whereas with Super Sonic, you get infinite boost, but you can't use any Wisps, so suddenly you have to take different routes to the levels and go to certain parts of the level that you maybe wouldn't go through if you were playing as normal Sonic, so I think it's kind of cool. But ultimately, Super Sonic doesn't feel like he plays substantially differently from normal Sonic, so it's not as game-changing as I wish it was, but it's still a pretty cool thing. I definitely like having it here. And going back to Game Land for a bit, if we want to consider these special stages, which they kind of are, because they're the levels you do for getting the Chaos Emeralds, then I guess you could kind of argue that these are sort of some of the best special stages that have ever been in a Sonic game, because once again, They're not some crappy, stupid minigame that sucks. It's just more normal Sonic Colors gameplay, which is great. Unfortunately, the level design in these Gameland levels isn't the best, so they're not super fun, really. But I'll still take this over the mediocre minigames that we see in way too many Sonic games. Also, a nice little thing that I want to note is some of the levels in Gameland here are recreations of Sonic 1 levels, which that was pretty cool to notice. And these are definitely the best levels in all of Gameland. Like, really, you could have just remade all the Sonic 1 levels and made that Gameland, and that probably would have been way more fun, but I guess considering this is really built for multiplayer, maybe that wouldn't work super well. I don't know, whatever. Gameland, it's fine, but not something that I find fun enough to bother time attacking these levels. I will stick to the main levels. I also want to quickly talk about S-ranks a little bit in this game, because I have never actually gone for all the S-ranks in Sonic Colors, and I didn't do it here either, because the scoring system in Sonic Colors and getting S-ranks is really bizarre, because it's not like other Sonic games where you have to play through the level quickly, but also try to do as many things to get points as you can along the way, which even that I'm not a fan of. In Sonic Colors, even that kind of play doesn't get you an S-rank most of the time. It's really about just interacting with as many things as you possibly can, which is very, very strange. Most of the S-ranks I was getting playing Sonic Colors, I got them when I was looking for red rings, when I was slowly meandering through the levels, trying to check every single route. That's what got me S-ranks, because that's really all that matters, just to do as many things as you possibly can. Kill all the enemies, collect as many quills as you can, use as many Wisp powers as you can, sidestep as much as you can, because for some reason that gives you points. It's very weird, the scoring system in this game, and I do not like it at all. So going for S-ranks is something that I've never found enjoyable in Sonic Colors, but whatever, I can just ignore it. You don't even get a reward for it, so who cares? Lastly, of course, we have to talk about time attack, my favorite part of a Sonic game, and I gotta say, I was pleasantly surprised coming back to Sonic Colors. Time attack in this game is actually kinda sick, dude. I haven't played Sonic Colors in a very, very, very long time, and the last time I did, I was nowhere near as good at Sonic games as I am now. So, playing through this time around, I found so many cool shortcuts and interesting things about time attacking this game that I never found before. And I had a lot of fun playing this game for speed for so many reasons. Like, for one, I think the level design in this game, for the most part, is just really good in general. It works well, it feels like Sonic, it's just fun. But also, this game's unique aspects make it much more interesting than a lot of other Sonic games to try to speed through. For example, the limited boost meter, it matters so much. Like I said, in Unleashed, you can just mindlessly boost all the time, but if you want to really optimize in Sonic Colors, that is not going to fly, because sure, I could boost right now through this section, but then I'm not going to have any boost for the next section, and if I boosted there, I would actually get more bang for my buck. That would save me more time than boosting through this earlier section, so sometimes you gotta think about the level design in a grander way. Instead of just reacting to what's right immediately in front of you, you gotta plan ahead. You gotta incorporate all of the level design into your routing and think about what are the good times to use your resources. Another thing with boosting is that when you're in scripted sequences, a lot of times boosting doesn't actually speed you up. It doesn't do anything other than waste your meter, so you gotta pay attention when you're in scripted sequences. If you boost, does it actually do anything? And if not, don't waste your meter, save it for when it's actually gonna make a difference. Also, because you get boost meter from killing specific enemies that are marked to give you boost and collecting Wisp capsules, you gotta incorporate that into your routing as well. It might be faster to just run past that enemy, but if you kill that enemy, it'll give you some boost meter, which will allow you to go even faster later on. So you gotta think about all that. Like, maybe it's worth it to just take that little extra time to get that meter. Another really big aspect of this that I kinda loved was how Wisps incorporate into meter management, because you can maybe take the top route of an area, and maybe you don't need a Wisp for that, you can just boost through it, and it's very quickly, and maybe the route below that, is a little bit slower, but it's a Wisp route, and so you're like, oh, well, I'll just take the top route, because that's the fastest one, obviously. But maybe not. It's not really that simple in Sonic Colors, because when you're using Wisp powers, you're not spending meter, so yeah, maybe you'll get through this section faster, but you've spent all of your boost meter, and then you can't use it in the next section where it will be even faster. So maybe it's better to take the slightly lower route here that's a little bit slower, but you won't be using up meter. It's faster to take this Wisp route than it is to not boost through the top route. So you incorporate Wisps into your meter management, where it's like, okay, I can save meter here by using a Wisp, but still go relatively quickly, so that way I have meter for later on where I can really go fast. It was so interesting. There were like red herrings in the level design where it's like, oh yeah, this is the fastest way to go for sure. But when you really think about it, when you zoom out, when you look at the whole level, it's actually not faster. It's actually a little bit slower if you really want to go to that next level and really speed yourself up. It was really sick. Like, this kind of meter management is completely absent from pretty much any other boost game. Even Sonic Rush, which I thought had pretty good meter management, this is on, like, another level. And I really enjoyed it because it kind of makes these levels feel like puzzles, where you gotta try to figure out how do you go as quickly as possible. It's not just about platforming well, it's not just about being skilled and knowing the level design. It's really about thinking it through and looking at all the different elements of the level and kind of piecing them together into different sequences and comparing, is this faster than that? Well, it's faster in this part, but overall, maybe it is, maybe it's not, I gotta see. And you just keep comparing all of these different routes where, like, okay, I'll try the top route here, and then the lower route with the Wisp there, and then back to the top route. I don't really have a lot of boost meter. Maybe it's faster if I don't. Maybe if I don't boost in that earlier section, but then if I do them going kind of slow, maybe I should use the Wisp there, or maybe not. Actually, wait, if I save the Wisp for even later in the level, I can take this whole other crazy shortcut that's not even intended, and that will do really well. But that means I'm going through this whole Wisp section without the Wisp, which is pretty slow, but it's actually ultimately still fast. It's so interesting. I love it. It was so much fun thinking of what to do when trying to route out these levels. And this works really well with what I was talking about earlier, how this game is more designed around platforming, how I found so many more opportunities for things like slope jumps in this game than I ever did in Sonic Unleashed. I already thought this was a really good, really fun game, but now coming back to it and doing all this stuff, I like it even more than I did before. This game is fucking sick, dude. But there's something about Sonic Colors that I've yet to talk about that we definitely need to discuss. This game is really good, and for the most part, this game has a really good reputation with just general gamers. Most people think that this is a really fun Sonic game. It's got a pretty good reputation. A lot of people like it, and a lot of Sonic fans like it as well. But in recent times, there has been a growing number of Sonic fans who think that this game is terrible. And I'm gonna be honest, I have absolutely no idea what these people are on about. I think this game is fantastic. A lot of the criticisms I hear from people that don't like Sonic Colors, I don't agree at all with what they're saying, or I don't even see what's making them feel that way. The only one that I will agree with is the story issues here, which we'll get to in another video. But as far as the game and the gameplay, I don't see it. I think this game is fantastic. Like, one thing that I always hear about Sonic Colors that people criticize so much is that this game is mostly 2D, which is true. I've not talked about that yet. This game is much more 2D than it is 3D. You know, Sonic Unleashed, it would switch between 2D and 3D, but it was relatively balanced, I felt, in that game. Not so in Sonic Colors. This game is much, much more 2D than it is 3D. Probably like 70% of your playtime in this is spent in 2D. And a lot of people really take issue with that. And I don't really understand why, because I don't know if you've ever played Sonic games before, but most of the best ones are 2D. Like, 2D Sonic games are amazing. So this game being a 2D Sonic game, I don't see a problem with that. That's great. I love 2D Sonic games. What's the issue? A lot of it feels like what I mentioned in my first Unleashed video, where it feels like people are just upset with it on principle, that this is supposedly a 3D Sonic game, but you spend most of it in 2D. And it's like, okay, whatever. Who cares if it's actually really a 2D Sonic game? It's a good 2D Sonic game, so what does it matter? Though a lot of people will say that the 2D level design in this game is really bad, and I don't agree with that. But one criticism that I see a lot, in particular with the level design, is that it is very blocky, which can definitely be true. A lot of the 2D level design in Sonic Colors is just a bunch of blocks floating around, and it is kind of ugly. But I think the level design, when you actually play it in a lot of these sections, is perfectly fine. It works. It's not the best thing in the world, but it's fun, so I really don't have a problem with it. And here's the thing about this. Both this criticism of blocky level design and the overprevalence of 2D in Sonic Colors. I want to say something about this that I think most people don't know about this game. When you play through Sonic Colors, another thing I haven't mentioned is that this game is split into zones, but this game has like 6 acts per zone, something like that. Which is a lot more than any other Sonic game, but when you play through a lot of these acts, you find yourself going, wait a minute, this is just a part of the level that I did earlier, like, this is that section, but they've, you know, remixed the level design, there are different hazards and enemies and wisp placements and everything, so you get a relatively new experience, but it's reusing the same levels and assets and everything. And, you know, immediately you go, okay, so this game is padded out to shit with a bunch of crap like that. You know, they've done that in, like, every 3D Sonic game with Adventure and Heroes, and Unleashed does it, 06 does it. It's just a thing in Sonic games. You gotta stretch out the game time because people demand their games to be long. And in the case of Sonic Colors, it's really noticeable because there are kind of like 2 types of levels when you play Sonic Colors. There are the bigger levels that feel like just normal, straightforward Sonic levels, and then there are these smaller levels that are a lot more gimmick-oriented. They take place in a very small section of a level, and a lot of these levels can be over in, you know, a matter of seconds in some cases if you just rush to the end. And they're just a little bit strange. They feel very much like padding, for sure, and that's because they literally are exactly that. An interesting thing about Sonic Colors is people have looked into the code in this game, and they found that certain acts of the game are tagged with the old Act 1, or the first half of the old Act 2, and the second half of the old Act 2. And when you look at those comments, and you look at the levels associated with them, it's all the bigger, more straightforward, traditional Sonic levels that are like that. So, almost certainly, what happened with this game is it was probably designed to be like more of a traditional Sonic game, 2 acts per zone, and that would be that. And a lot of these smaller acts were probably initially going to be side missions that you could do optionally if you wanted to, because they feel very akin to the kind of like town missions and stuff from Sonic Unleashed. And if we look at Sonic Colors DS, for example, that is exactly the case. It's 2 acts per zone with some missions that take the levels and remix them a little bit and give you some kind of objective. So they must have tried to pad out the playtime of Sonic Colors, because if you just play what is the intended original main game, then the game is only like an hour long. So they're like, we gotta stretch this out. Take all those side acts and incorporate them into the main game playthrough, make them all mandatory levels. And these little smaller side levels that have been turned into main levels, this is where a lot of people's complaints come from. This is where most of that blocky level design is, and these smaller levels, almost all of them are entirely 2D. There's very few of them that have any 3D or have you switching back and forth. Whereas if you just look at only the main levels of Sonic Colors, they feel much more like Sonic Unleashed levels with a better balance of 2D and 3D gameplay. It still does lean more toward 2D, but it's much more even. And a really cool thing that I need to mention about Sonic Colors DX is that when you're setting it up, you can configure the game to substantial acts only, which is the originally intended levels in their originally intended order, and none of the side levels incorporated into the main game playthrough. And I played through the game that way, and it's fantastic. Even though I like the normal Sonic Colors the way it is, playing this version of it, the originally intended version, the pacing is so much better. The levels and their flow from one to the other feel so much more natural. If you're one of those people who dislikes Sonic Colors because of how much 2D it is and all the blocky level design, I implore you, give Sonic Colors DX a try and pick Substantial Acts only. I think you will have a much better experience with this game that way. And really, this shouldn't be surprising, because it's just like so many other Sonic games where they try to pad out the game length and it ultimately ends up harming the game. And it didn't even really work in the case of Sonic Colors, because even with all these extra side acts now forced into the main playthrough, all it really did was take a 1-hour game and make it into a 2-hour game. It's still incredibly short and doesn't really make a difference, so why did they even bother doing this? All it did was make a small portion of Sonic fans not like this game. It's almost like padding out your game is a really bad thing to do, and people should focus less on game length and more on game quality, but that's a rant for another time, maybe. Anyway, another criticism I often hear for Sonic Colors is that people don't like the Wisps, but specifically what I hear is that they don't like the Wisps because they essentially take other characters' abilities and give them to Sonic, which is absolutely true if you look at a lot of them. Like, the Hover Wisp is not at all dissimilar from Tails' Flying, or I look at the Drill Wisp and I'm like, well, this could be a Knuckles ability easy. A lot of these Wisp abilities do really feel like abilities that other Sonic characters would have, but you can't play as other Sonic characters in this game, so they turn them into power-ups and stuff. And a lot of people don't like that because obviously people like playing as multiple different Sonic characters and everything, and the fact that you can only play as Sonic in this game, people don't like, so they kind of take umbrage with the Wisps taking away multiple playable characters and replacing it with just playing as Sonic. But I personally don't feel that's a very fair criticism, because that was the entire point. Whether or not you agree with it, it's very clear that at this time, Sonic Team did not want to do multiple playable characters. They wanted games where you only play as Sonic, due to all the negative backlash of all the 2000s games where you had all these playable characters, and, you know, the Sonic Stupid Friends complaints was at an all-time high. So they're like, okay, no one likes Sonic's friends, we're just gonna have Sonic as the only playable character, but we still want to have that gameplay variety for multiple playable characters with different abilities, so we're gonna reincorporate their different abilities into power-ups instead. And in that context, I think the Wisps work really well. Again, this feels like more of an issue on principle rather than it actually being bad. I don't like the Wisps because they replace having multiple playable characters, which I like more. That's fine, but that's not a criticism of the game. The Wisps, on their own, isolated, are perfectly fine. They work well. I think they're well designed. I think the game is better than if they were not here. Is it better than if it had multiple playable characters instead? I don't know. Maybe it would have been better with other playable characters, but that's not what they wanted to do. So, okay, fair enough. Just because it's not what you want doesn't mean it's bad. This is the exact same thing as classic Sonic fans complaining about games not having proper physics, which I've done in the past with, like, Sonic Adventure, but then I put that aside and just look at the game for what it is and say it's still a really fun game, and I feel the exact same way with Wisps. Would I prefer more playable characters instead? Yeah, probably. But I put that aside and just look at the Wisps on their own, and they're good. They're fine. They work well. They make the game more fun, in my opinion. So, yeah, they're good. I don't really have any issues with how they are incorporated into the game. It's the exact same thing I've said in a couple of my previous Sonic videos. You have to criticize something for what it is, not what it isn't, because that's not fair. Then you could just criticize a game for anything arbitrarily, because it's not what I like. You know, I like turn-based strategy RPGs, and Sonic Colors isn't a turn-based strategy RPG, so it's bad. No, that's not okay. And similarly, the game being mostly 2D is not a criticism. The game having blocky level design is not a criticism. Sonic being the only playable character is not a criticism. Those are just the attributes of the game. It's also worth mentioning that I get the feeling that a lot of this criticism isn't really about Sonic Colors itself, but about how Sonic Colors has influenced a lot of following Sonic games in ways people do not like. But once again, that is not fair towards Sonic Colors. It's not this game's fault that Sonic Team learned the wrong lessons from it and pushed the series in the wrong direction. And in that same kind of vein, another thing I hear about Sonic Colors fairly often, and a lot of following Sonic games, is that this game isn't ambitious like a lot of the 2000 Sonic games were. And that is absolutely true. This game is nowhere near as ambitious as previous Sonic games, especially Unleash, which is the biggest, most epicest, most ambitious Sonic game they've ever made. This is nowhere near that. But again, I don't think that's a criticism. In fact, in my opinion, Sonic Colors not being ambitious is a massive boon to the game, because when we look at all of these ambitious Sonic games that people talk about, most of them suck overall. Most of them are so painfully flawed. Like I said, Sonic Unleashed is the most ambitious Sonic game ever. And it's fucking terrible overall, because most of that ambition goes into padding out the game with a bunch of horrible crap that nobody likes. Werehog gameplay, all the stupid town missions, the weird nighttime combat challenges with the camera, the overabundance of collectibles, the hot dog missions that are absolutely terrible. All this stuff that does not actually make the game any better whatsoever. That's where all of that ambition goes, and that's been the case all the way since Sonic Adventure. Fishing and plane levels and all of this crap. Ambition in Sonic, what it really means is Sonic Team wasting development resources, making their game worse. In my opinion, I would actually say that Sonic Colors is a very ambitious game, because it ambitioned to be a good video game, and unlike all of the other more ambitious 3D Sonic games, it actually succeeded at what it was trying to do. I've said it many times before, I prefer my games to be focused on what makes them good and what makes them fun. And lo, when Sonic does that, it's most of the best Sonic games. The classic games, the advanced games, the rush games, and I would put Sonic Colors right up there with them. It's just a Sonic game, and it's fun, and it's good the whole time. This is the first fucking 3D Sonic game that I can just recommend to people. It's not good for a Sonic game. It's not good, but there's all these parts that suck. It's just a good video game, and that is far more important, in my opinion, than being ambitious. So there you go, there's my thoughts on Sonic Colors. I know a lot of people were hoping that I would be shitting on this game in this video, but I'm sorry, I am not with y'all on this. I think that this is a great game. I love Sonic Colors. I've loved it ever since it came out, and now I like it even more than I did back then. This game is great. I do not hate it at all. I have very little to criticize it over. It's just a great game to me. However, there is one part of this game that I definitely do have to criticize quite a bit, and that would be the story, but we're gonna have to save that for another video. Until then, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed, I'll see you next time.